You get used to the sounds. That's the first thing you learn out here. At first, it's all just noise, a terrifying, crashing chaos that makes you want to dig a hole with your fingernails and never come out. But after a few weeks, your ear learns to sort it out, like picking out instruments in an orchestra. And that orchestra, when the line is holding, has a rhythm to it, a kind of grim music that lets you know you're still part of something organized, something that makes sense. There was a comfort in that. Out front, maybe a kilometer away, you'd hear the steady crump, crump, crump of our own artillery, the 10.5s, firing methodically, walking their fire across Naaman's land. That was the Bass line. Then, closer, the sharper, faster chatter of an MG-42 from our support trench, a sound like tearing canvas, so fast it doesn't have individual shots, just one long, ripping scream. That was our music. And over it all, the voices. Sergeant Hofer's gravelly bark. Muller, keep your head down. Schneider, watch that tree line. Orders, always orders. That was the most important sound, the sound of someone being in charge. It was a mask, you see. A mask over the fear that was always there, churning in your gut. As long as the guns were firing in rhythm and the sergeant was shouting, you could pretend you were a cog in a great, powerful machine, not just a scared boy from Hamburg lying in the freezing mud. And the machines themselves, oh, the sounds they made. The low, guttural rumble of a Panzer IV rolling up to the line, the clanking of its tracks, a sound of pure, brute strength. You'd hear that deep-throated diesel grumble and you'd feel a little safer, like a big metal brother had arrived. Or the hum of the field generator behind the command post, a steady, electric buzz that meant someone somewhere was still communicating, still plotting, still in control. Even the simple sound of a boot scraping against the firing step, or the click of a Mauser bolt being worked, these were the sounds of routine, of an army doing its job. We'd de-huddle in our foxhole, me and Klaus, my buddy from Bremen, and we'd listen to this symphony. We'd de-share a cigarette, the smoke tasting like home, and Klaus would say, "See, Hans, they're playing our song again." It was a dark joke, but we meant it. The sound of battle was terrible, but the sound of organized battle of a front that was holding was a lullaby compared to what came later. You could almost sleep to it, the way you can sleep on a train, trusting the rhythm to carry you forward. But then the music started to change. It was subtle at first. The crump, crump, crump of our artillery, that steady heartbeat, began to falter. There'd be a long pause, then a few scattered shots, then silence. A silence that was louder than any explosion. And in that silence, you'd hear new sounds. The sharper, more frantic crack of individual rifles taking over, a sound of desperation, not of purpose. And then the whine, the one we all learned to dread, the whine of incoming shells, but not from far away. These were close. The ground didn't just shake, it leaped under you. The air wasn't just split, it was torn into pieces. And that's when you noticed the most terrifying sound of all, the absence. The silence where the panzers used to be. You de-strain your ears, waiting for that familiar rumble, for the clanking that meant a counterattack, and you'd hear nothing but the whistle of the wind and the distant, growing thunder of their artillery, rolling closer like a summer storm. That's when the voices changed, too. The shouted orders stopped being clear. Instead of Schmidt covering fire, it was just shouting, panicked shouts you couldn't make out. You'd see runners scrambling back, their faces pale, and they weren't saying anything coherent. We were listening, all of us, ears pressed against the dirt almost, listening for the one order we both hoped for and dreaded, the order to pull back. But it never came clearly. It was just confusion. Hofer came down the line, his face a mask of dirt and grimace, and he didn't bark. His voice was low, strained. "Be ready to move," was all he said. "Be ready to move on my signal." But what was the signal? A whistle? A flare? He didn't say. He just moved on, and we were left with the terrible uncertainty, listening to the symphony fall apart into dissonance and noise. Klaus looked at me, his eyes wide, and he didn't make a joke. He just shook his head slowly. That was worse than any shell. That was the moment the machine, the great German war machine we were all just cogs in, started to grind its gears and shudder to a halt. Then it broke. It wasn't an orderly withdrawal. That's a lie they tell in the history books. It was a rupture. One moment we were waiting, the next, someone screamed, "They're through on the left," and it was like a dam breaking. There was no signal, no orderly fallback by squads. It was just a sudden, collective understanding that if you stayed, you died. And the sounds of that retreat, God, I can still hear them if I close my eyes. It wasn't the sound of marching boots, that confident tramp-tramp-tramp. It was a scuffle, a desperate, slipping, sliding sound of boots on mud and ice and snow, of men running, tripping, getting up and running again. It was the sound of labored breathing, your own, and the man next to you, great ragged gasps that burned your lungs in the cold air. It was the clatter of equipment being discarded, not thrown, just dropped. A helmet bouncing off a rock, a mess tin clanging, a rifle hitting the ground as a man decided an extra 2 pounds wasn't worth his life. You heard the sickening, wet thud of a body hitting the ground behind you, and you didn't look back. You couldn't, because if you looked back, you'd de-stop, and if you stopped, you were next. And over this cacophony of our own panic, you could hear the sounds of the pursuit. The most feared sound in the east, the high-pitched, mosquito-like whine of the Il-2 Sturmovik. You'd hear it long before you saw it, a buzzing on the horizon that grew into a snarling dive, followed by the ripping sound of its cannons and the explosions of its bombs. It felt personal, like it was hunting you, just you. And behind that, further away but getting closer, the sound of the enemy infantry, not shots but cheers. They were advancing, and they were cheering. It was a sound of confidence, of victory, and it made our own panic seem even more pathetic. But the worst sounds were the intimate ones, the ones that happened right next to you. The pleading. Young Becker, who'd caught a piece of shrapnel in his leg, was sitting against a tree, his face white as a sheet. He grabbed my boot as I ran past. "Hans, don't leave me. Please, Hans, my mother." His voice was so small, so full of tears. I looked into his eyes, and I saw my own fear reflected back at me. I had to pull my boot away. I had to. The sound of my own heart was pounding in my ears, drowning out his pleas, a frantic, animal drumbeat that just said, "Run, run, run." That sound, the sound of your own body betraying your conscience, that's a sound that never leaves you. We ran until the light started to fail, until our lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. We found what passed for a defensive position, a slight rise in the ground, a few scattered trees. We collapsed there, maybe 30 of us from a company that had been over 100 strong just that morning. And that's when the silence came. Not a true silence, but an eerie, unnatural quiet after hours of deafening noise. It was more frightening than the battle. In the battle, the noise was a blanket that smothered your thoughts. Now, in the quiet, every thought rushed in. You could hear the wind moaning through the branches, a lonely, cold sound. You could hear the low moans of the wounded men we had managed to drag with us. And you could hear the small, furtive sounds of men trying to exist, the click of a canteen cap, a low cough, the rustle of a greatcoat as someone shivered. But mostly, you listened. You strained your ears, staring out into the deepening twilight, listening for the sounds you knew were coming, the crunch of snow under a boot that wasn't ours, the clink of a foreign equipment buckle, the guttural sound of a Russian order. Every snap of a twig was a patrol. Every shift of the wind was an enemy creeping closer. And inside your head there was another sound, a voice that just kept asking the same question over and over. What now? What now? What now? The reality of it was settling in, colder than the snow seeping through my trousers. We were retreating. Not a tactical withdrawal, a retreat. The word itself tasted like ash. The machine was broken. The orchestra was gone, replaced by this terrible, waiting silence. Klaus was sitting next to me, his head in his hands. I nudged him and offered him a piece of black bread. He just shook his head. There was no joke left in him. There was nothing left in any of us but the cold, the fear, and the silence. That was the sound of defeat. Not a bang, but a whimper, a long, drawn-out sigh of a broken army, waiting in the dark for whatever was coming next. And you know, in that silence, the only thing you could think about wasn't the fatherland, or the Fuhrer, or any of that grand nonsense. It was the sound of your mother's voice, or the sound of the tram car running down your street back home. Simple, ordinary sounds that belonged to a world that didn't exist anymore, a world that was now further away than the stars. You want to know what it was like, towards the end? Not the dates and the places the generals talk about, but what it really felt like. I'll tell you, it wasn't in the big battles, not for me anyway. It was in the small things. It was in trying to write a letter home. That's where you could see the whole damn war, right there on a soggy piece of paper. I found a notebook in an abandoned farmhouse. The pages were a bit damp and smelled of mold and smoke, but it was better than nothing. My hands, God, my hands were a mess. Caked in dirt that was ground so deep into the cracks it looked like a map of some godforsaken river delta. My fingernails were black, broken, and they wouldn't stop shaking. Not from fear exactly, though that was always there, a constant hum in your chest. It was more from the cold, a cold that had settled into your bones weeks ago and decided to take up permanent residence. It was from exhaustion, a tiredness so deep you felt it in your teeth. Just holding the pencil was a chore, trying to make my fingers remember how to form letters, the same letters my mother taught me to write at the kitchen table a lifetime ago. I had to find a dry spot, which was a joke in itself. The whole world was mud. I was sitting on a broken crate, using my knee as a desk, tucked into what was left of a barn, the roof mostly gone, letting in a fine, cold drizzle that felt like needles on your face. And all the while, the world outside was screaming. Shells would land every few minutes, not the big barrages, just sporadic, hateful blows, like a giant trying to stamp out an anthill. Each one would make the ground jump, and I watch a little shower of dirt and splinters rain down from the beams above. My buddy Klaus was a few feet away, trying to light a damp cigarette with hands as shaky as mine, muttering curses under his breath. He looked over at me and said, "Writing to your sweetheart, Erich. Tell her we're having a lovely holiday." And he gave that laugh, the one we all had, a dry, hollow sound that had no joy in it, just a kind of bitter acknowledgement of the sheer absurdity of it all. That was the thing, you see, the absurdity. Here I was trying to perform this normal human act, this ritual of connection to a world that felt like a dream, while hell was practicing its scales all around us. The pencil felt alien in my hand, a tool for a civilization we'd left behind. But you had to do it. You had to cling to it. It was the only thread left that connected you to the person you used to be, the boy who slept in a soft bed and ate hot meals and didn't know the smell of burning flesh. So I started to write. "Dear Mother," it always began. And then came the lies. You had to lie. It was a duty as important as cleaning your rifle. You couldn't tell them the truth. The truth was a poison, and you couldn't send that through the mail. You couldn't let it seep into their quiet living rooms with the lace curtains and the smell of good bread. So you reached for the standard phrases, the ones every soldier used, the currency of reassurance. "I am well," I wrote that, while a sharp, gnawing pain dug into my gut from the slab of hard black bread I'd forced down an hour ago. The food is adequate. Adequate for what? For keeping a skeleton walking. We were living on scraps, on whatever we could scavenge from deserted villages, on the hope of a captured Allied supply crate. We are in a quiet sector. I wrote that just as a shell whistled overhead and exploded maybe 200 meters away, the concussion hitting my chest like a physical blow. The air tasted of cordite and burnt earth. In the distance, I could hear the terrible, high-pitched screaming of a horse that had stepped on a mine. That sound, you never forget that. An animal's pain is so pure, so innocent. It cuts through you. And what was I describing this retreat as? A strategic repositioning. That's the words I used. A nice, clean military term. It sounded almost intelligent, like something a staff officer would point to on a map with a neat little pointer. It didn't describe the reality of it, the chaotic, stumbling, headlong flight it really was. It didn't describe the feeling of your feet, frozen blocks of meat, sloshing through endless kilometers of mud that sucked at your boots with every step, trying to pull you down into the earth. It didn't describe the sight of our walking wounded, men with blank eyes and blood-soaked bandages, leaning on their comrades, just putting one foot in front of the other because there was nowhere else to go. It didn't describe the faces of the dead we left behind, friends I'd joked with just the day before, now just pale, still things in the ditch, their eyes open to the rain. I made a conscious decision, right there with the pencil in my hand, to omit all of that. To omit the cold that made your teeth chatter so hard you thought they'd shatter. To omit the hunger that was a constant, grinding companion. To omit the face of young Peter, who couldn't have been more than 17, who took a piece of shrapnel right next to me outside a village whose name I forgot. The look in his eyes wasn't fear, it was surprise, like a child who'd been unfairly scolded. He just said, "Oh," and then he was gone. No, you don't write that home. You build a wall with your words, a wall between the world of the living and the world of the dying, and you try to keep your family safe on their side of it. But the truth has a way of leaking out. It's in the things you almost write. My hand hovered over the page, and I could feel the words pushing up from somewhere deep inside, words I knew I could never put down. I wanted to describe the exhaustion, and I don't mean just being tired. I mean a fatigue that goes deeper than bone, that settles in your soul. It's the weight of the pack, yes, but it's also the weight of the days and the nights, the weight of the fear, the weight of seeing too much. It's a leaden feeling that makes every movement an effort of will. I wanted to describe the constant taste in your mouth, a metallic taste, like you've been sucking on a penny. That's what fear tastes like. It's always there at the back of your throat. And the longing, God, the longing. It wasn't just for home, not in a general sense. It was for specific, stupid things. The feeling of a warm, dry bed with real sheets. The smell of my mother's potato soup. The sound of rain on a proper roof. A comforting sound, not this malevolent drizzle that soaked you to the skin and chilled you to the marrow. I almost wrote about the dreams I had, not grand dreams of victory or peace, just simple dreams of being warm. That's all I ever dreamed about, just being warm. But you can't write that. So the truth comes out in other ways. It's in the handwriting itself. My mother would have seen it. The script wasn't my neat schoolboy hand. It was rushed, jagged, the letters stumbling over each other. An ink blot from the rain or from my own shaking hand smudged the word well, a perfect black tear. That blot told more of a story than any word I could have written. It spoke of haste, of chaos, of a lack of control. It was a stain of reality on the clean lie of the text. And then you get to the end. You always sign off the same way. Your loving son. But that day my hand froze above the signature. I hesitated. For a long moment I just stared at those words. Your loving son. And I thought, is this the last thing she will ever read from me? Will this piece of paper, with its shaky writing and its pathetic lies, be the final artifact of my life? Will it be the thing she holds in her hands when the official telegram arrives? That thought was like a cold knife in my heart. The words suddenly felt like an epitaph. Signing my name felt like sealing my fate. It was a superstition, I know, but in that moment it felt terribly, terribly real. I looked down at the finished letter. It was a pathetic thing, a collection of clichés and false comforts, and for a second I felt a surge of anger. Anger at the war for making me lie. Anger at myself for being too cowardly to tell the truth. The lies felt like a betrayal, not of my mother, but of myself, of the boy I used to be. He deserved a better story than this, but sending the truth. That was unthinkable. That would be like sending a piece of the horror itself, a fragment of a shell, through the mail. It would land on her doormat and explode all the same. I couldn't do that. I couldn't burden her with the knowledge of this mud, this cold, this fear. Her world, with its worries about the price of butter and the neighbor's gossip, was a sanctuary, and I was damned if I was going to be the one to breach its walls. So I made a decision. I folded the letter, but I didn't put it in an envelope. I looked at it for a long time, sitting there on my knee. Then slowly I tore it in half. Then I tore it again and again into little scraps. Klaus looked over. Bad news? He asked, his voice flat. No, I said, just not worth sending. I opened my hand and let the pieces fall into the mud at my feet. They lay there, white against the dark brown, like strange, wounded snowflakes. The fine rain quickly soaked them. The ink began to run, turning the words into grey, meaningless smudges. I watched it happen. I watched until the paper started to dissolve, becoming part of the mud. And that felt right. That felt like the truest thing I had done all day. That letter, with its lies and its almost truths, was a perfect metaphor for the whole experience. This grand retreat, this strategic repositioning, it wasn't a neat line on a map. It was a messy, chaotic, disintegrating thing, just like those scraps of paper. It was promises turning to mud. It was connections dissolving. It was men being ground down into the earth until there was nothing left. I stood up, my joints cracking, my body one solid ache. The resolve that came over me then wasn't heroic. It wasn't about flags or fatherlands. It was simple and brutal and animal. Just survive. Get through this one more day. Then the next. The act of writing, of even attempting it, became a silent promise I made to myself. A promise for a future that felt like a fairy tale, a future that was so distant and unlikely it hardly seemed real. But you had to believe in it, even a little. Because without that, you just lie down in the mud next to the scraps of your letter and let the rain wash you away. So you picked up your rifle. You looked at Klaus, and he gave you a tiny nod, and you both started walking again, into the rain, into the sound of the guns, just trying to survive one more day. You hear a lot of sounds in a retreat, sounds that get stuck in your head forever. The crunch of frozen snow under your boots, a rhythm you don't even think about until it stops. The constant, low grumble of distant artillery, like a stomach ache in the earth itself. The wind, which somehow always finds its way down your collar, no matter how tightly you button your tunic. But there's one sound, one particular sound, that cuts through all the rest, a sound that becomes a physical weight you carry for the rest of your life. It's not the whistle of an incoming shell or the zip of a bullet past your ear. It's the sound of a bullet or a piece of shrapnel finding a home in the body of the man next to you. For me, that man was Klaus. We weren't from the same town or anything. We'd been thrown together in this mess. Two scared kids who'd learned that the only thing you could really trust was the guy sharing your foxhole. We'd shared bad rations, worse jokes, and the kind of fear that makes your bones feel cold. We had a system, a routine. You move, you hit the dirt, you listen, you move again. It was during one of those moves, a frantic dash across a farmer's field that was more slop than soil, that it happened. One moment, Klaus was right beside me, his breath puffing out in sharp, white clouds, his rifle held tight. The next, there was this sound. It wasn't loud, not like an explosion. It was a wet, thick thud, like someone dropping a heavy sack of grain onto a muddy floor. It's a sickening sound, a private sound, and it's immediately drowned out by the sharper crack of the sniper's rifle that followed it. My training, drilled into me over and over, screamed at me to hit the dirt, to find cover, to return fire. That's what the book says. But there's another book, an older one, written in your gut, and it said something else entirely. I saw Klaus go down, not like in the movies where guys fly backwards, but just collapse in on himself, his legs giving way like they were made of string. And I saw his eyes. That's the thing they never tell you about. It's not the blood you see first, it's the eyes. They were wide, full of surprise, sure, but underneath that was a raw animal fear, a pleading. It wasn't a plea to God or to the universe. It was a plea to me. It was the fear of being left behind in that freezing mud alone. And in that split second, the gut book won. I dropped down next to him, the cold mud seeping through my trousers instantly. Klaus, Klaus, where is it? He just groaned, his hand clutching his side, the grey wool of his greatcoat already turning a dark, ugly purple. The others were shouting, laying down suppressing fire, gesturing for me to get moving. But I was already committed. I got my arms under him, and that's when the real burden began. Have you ever tried to lift a full-grown man who can't help you? It's not like lifting a sack of potatoes. A sack of potatoes is dead weight, it's predictable. A wounded man is a different kind of physics. He's a struggle. He's trying to help, God bless him, trying to get his feet under him, but his body won't obey. Every movement sends a jolt of pain through him, and he cries out, a short, choked-off sound he tries to swallow back down. And you're grunting with the effort, your own gear, the helmet, the ammunition pouches, the gas mask canister banging against your hip feels like it's made of lead. Your boots, caked with 10 pounds of mud each, sink into the ground with every step. It's a slog, a horrible, grinding slog. You're not running anymore. You're doing a miserable, clumsy dance, a slow-motion nightmare. After about 50 yards, my lungs were on fire. I could taste the cold, metallic air mixed with the sour taste of my own fear. My back screamed in protest. Klaus, through gritted teeth, whispered, "Just go, Erich. Leave me. I'll slow you down." That's when I started shedding things. My rifle was the first to go. It felt like a betrayal, dropping your weapon in the field. It was against every rule, every instinct. It was your life, but his life felt heavier. I let it fall into the mud. Then my pack. It had my extra socks, my rations, a little photo of my sister. It all disappeared into the slush. The weight lessened, but only a little. The real weight was Klaus. His head was lolling against my shoulder, and I could feel his breath, hot and ragged, on my neck. I kept muttering nonsense to him, more for me than for him, I think. "Almost there, buddy. Just hang on. We'll get you a warm bed, a real bed, with sheets." I was making promises I had no power to keep. I was painting a picture of a world that felt 1,000,000 miles away. He started whispering too, his voice fading in and out. He wasn't talking about the war. He was talking about his father's bakery. He described the smell of fresh bread in the morning, the way the sunlight came through the window and lit up the flour dust in the air. He told me about a girl named Lot, and how he was going to marry her when he got home. It was a distraction, a tiny bubble of warmth in all that freezing hell. And in that hour, hauling him through that God-forsaken field, a bond formed that was deeper than any blood oath or military pledge. It was silent, It was an agreement made without words. His life was my responsibility. It was as simple and as heavy as that. Every grunt of effort, every stifled cry from him, every squelching step was a word in that unspoken contract. We weren't soldier and soldier anymore. We were just two men, and one was carrying the other. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, we stumbled into a makeshift aid station they'd set up in the lee of a battered stone barn. It was chaos medics with bloodied hands, men crying out, the smell of iodine and blood, and unwashed bodies, so thick you could taste it. I laid Klaus down as gently as I could on a stretcher that was already stained dark. A medic gave me a nod and started cutting away his coat. The relief that washed over me was so powerful it made my knees weak. But it was immediately followed by a hollow, empty feeling. I'd been carrying this immense weight, this purpose, for what felt like hours, and now it was just gone. But my body didn't believe it. My shoulders ached with a phantom weight. My arms felt strangely light, almost useless. The cold air on my neck, where his breath had been, felt like a violation. I stood there, dumbly, watching the medics work, feeling more vulnerable than I ever had under fire. Without Klaus to carry, I was just a soldier again, a target. Then the order came to pull back, to keep moving. The line was shifting. I had to go. I looked back at Klaus one last time. He was pale, but his eyes were closed, and he seemed to be breathing more evenly. I felt a hand on my arm. It was the sergeant. "You did good, son," he said, his voice rough. "Now move out." And I did. I turned and started walking, my body aching with a fatigue that went right down to the marrow. But underneath the ache, there was a tiny, fragile thing. It was hope, not hope for victory or for glory, just the simple, desperate hope that I had saved a life. That Klaus would get to smell his father's bread again, that he'd see his lot. In a world that had gone mad, that small hope was the only thing that had any weight worth carrying. It's been decades, but sometimes, on a cold day, I can still feel that ache in my shoulders. It's not a pain I resent. It's a reminder. A reminder of Klaus, and the sound and the weight of a comrade. You want to know what the retreat sounded like? For most of the boys, it was the roar of the engines not starting, the crunch of tank tracks on the frozen roads, the distant thunder of the Russian artillery getting closer every day. But for me, it was a different kind of symphony, a hellish one. My war wasn't fought with a rifle, not really. It was fought with bandages and morphine and a pair of scissors. I was a sanitäter, a medic, and my world was defined not by the sights of the Eastern Front, but by its sounds. You see, when you're crawling through the mud and the smoke, your vision is a blur of grey snow and dark shapes. But your hearing becomes everything. It becomes your triage, your diagnosis, your death sentence. You learn to see with your ears. I remember the first time it really happened, this shift in how I perceived everything. It was outside a village whose name I've forgotten, just a cluster of huts really, after a counterattack that had stalled in a bloody mess. We were set up in what was left of a barn, the roof mostly gone, the cold seeping into your bones. And the sounds, Gott im Himmel, the sounds. It wasn't just the random crump of a shell in the distance anymore. It was a chorus of suffering, each note a man. You had to learn the score. There was the wet, rattling cough, we called it the Todesressel, the Deathratelauf, a lung shot. You'd hear that and you knew it was almost hopeless, but you had to try. Then there was the high, piercing scream, a pure, sharp sound that cut through everything else. That was often a bone fracture, a clean wound, believe it or not, a chance. But the worst sound was the silence. You'd come upon a man who was just staring at the sky, his eyes wide, and he wouldn't be making a sound. No moan, no whimper. Just a terrible, empty quiet. That was the most serious of all. That was the silence of a wound so terrible the body had already given up the ghost. And over all of it, a constant, desperate refrain. "Sanitäter, sanitäter." It started as a shout, then became a plea, and finally, for some, a whisper that faded away. That word, my title, became the most agonizing sound of all, because it meant I had to choose. You're running, your medical bag slapping against your hip, your breath coming in ragged gasps, and you hear that cry from your left. Then another, fainter, from a shell hole to your right. And you have to decide in a split second which voice to answer. You're playing guard with a stethoscope, and you're terrible at it. Your own breathing becomes this loud, internal drumbeat, a counter-rhythm to the moans and explosions, and all you can think is, please, not yet, just let me get to one more, just one more. You'd pick one, the closest, or the one whose voice sounded youngest, and you'd crawl to him, and the whole time the other cries would be digging into your soul. You never, ever got used to it. Anyone who tells you they did is a liar or a monster. Then, when you finally reached a man, the sounds would change. They became intimate, close-up. The world shrank to just you and him in a hole in the ground. The first thing was often the tear of the bandage package. That crisp, ripping sound was a promise, a little piece of order in the chaos. Then the snip of the scissors as you cut away the tattered, blood-soaked uniform to get to the wound. The fabric was always stiff, frozen with blood and mud. And then the wounds themselves had sounds. A stomach wound had a certain sickly, soft smell you could almost hear. A chest wound, a sucking one, would gurgle and hiss with every breath the boy tried to take. That's when you'd fumble for the verbenpection, the sealed bandage, and you'd press it hard against the hole, and you'd hear that awful gurgle stop, replaced by a sharp, pained intake of breath. And through it all, you'd talk. You'd talk nonsense. You'd talk about home. You'll be fine, Kamerad, it's just a scratch. The weather back home in Bavaria must be beautiful now. Think of the beer, your mother will be so proud. Your voice, you tried to keep it soft and steady. A little island of calm you were trying to build around this dying boy, a dam against the tidal wave of noise outside. You'd lie, and you'd lie beautifully, because the truth was too terrible to speak. But the most haunting sound, the one that stays with me even now, late at night, was the breathing. Not the death rattle, but the slow, shallow, almost peaceful breathing of a patient you knew, with absolute certainty you could not save. His wounds were too great, the evacuation too far away. You've done all you can. The morphine has taken hold. And he's just lying there, his head in your lap maybe, and he's breathing so softly in and out like a child sleeping. And you just sit there, listening to the life slowly ebb out of him. You can't hurry it. You can't stop it. You're just a witness. The battle noise fades away, the world disappears, and all that exists is that gentle, rhythmic sound of a man leaving this earth. You give anything for a scream, a curse, anything but that quiet, trusting breath. That's the sound that never leaves you. As the retreat proper began, the whole character of the soundscape changed. It was no longer a series of battles with pauses in between. It became a continuous, rolling medical catastrophe. The sound of orders, shouted commands, the organized movement of vehicles broke down and was replaced by a dissonant chaos. The worst sound now was the crying. Not the screams of fresh wounds, but the desperate, hopeless crying of men who knew they were being left behind. We couldn't move them. We had no trucks, no fuel, sometimes not even enough horses. The order would come down, only the walking wounded. And you'd have to walk past men who had fought beside you, men who knew your name, and they'd look at you, and they wouldn't even say Sanitäter anymore. They'd just cry, quiet, helpless sobs. That was the sound of our army breaking. Not the explosions, but the weeping. I remember one boy, he couldn't have been more than 18. Fritz, his name was. Both his legs were shattered by a mortar round. We were pulling back from a farmhouse, and I had to tell him. I knelt beside him, and the look in his eyes, he knew. He just said, "Herr Sanitäter, you will come back for me, yes?" And what could I say? I couldn't lie to him, not about that. So I did the only things I could. I gave him my last syringe of morphine. I placed my own water canteen next to him. And then I placed a stick grenade next to the canteen. He looked at it, then back at me, and he nodded. Just a slow, understanding nod. The sound of my own heart breaking was louder than any shell. It was a physical cracking sensation in my chest. I touched his shoulder, a useless gesture, and then I stood up and ran to catch up with the others. I didn't look back. The sound of my own boots crunching in the snow was the sound of betrayal. And pushing all of this, giving this terrible symphony its relentless tempo, was the new sound of the enemy advance. It was different from our own artillery. The Russian Katyushas, the Germans called them Stalin's organs. They made a screaming, tearing sound as they launched, and when they landed, it was like the world was being ripped apart. That sound got closer every day, every hour. It was a sound that didn't allow for careful work. It forced you to work faster, to make even more impossible choices. Triage became brutal. Before, you might spend a few minutes with a hopeless case to give him comfort. Now you had seconds, a glance, a gut feeling. Is he breathing? Can he walk? If the answer was no, you had to move on. The sound of the Katyushas was the sound of the clock running out for all of us. There were moments, though little islands of respite. After a particularly bad stretch, we'd find a wood that was momentarily quiet, or a valley where the shelling couldn't reach. And the silence that fell was. It was unnatural. It was heavy. The only sounds would be the wind sighing through the pine trees and the buzzing of flies. Always the flies. They were everywhere, a constant droning accompaniment to death. And in that silence, you could almost hear the accusations. The eyes of the men you'd left behind seemed to be watching you from the shadows. That silence was worse than the noise, in a way. The noise kept you busy. It gave you a purpose, however horrific. The silence left you alone with your thoughts. And that's when the internal sounds would start, the echoes. In the quiet, my mind would replay it all, the wet cough of the lung shot, the whispered sanitetto, the slow, shallow breathing of the boy I couldn't save, Fritz's quiet sob. It was a ghost orchestra inside my head, and the conductor was my own guilt. You try to shut it out, to think of home, of your mother's face, of the smell of fresh bread. But the war sounds were always louder. They still are sometimes. You learn to live with the ghosts, but they never really leave you. They just get quieter most of the time. You see, for a soldier, the war is the battles, the advances, the retreats. For a medic, the war is the men. It's the weight of a head in your lap. It's the feel of a pulse fluttering under your finger. It's the sound of a last breath on the wind. My war wasn't defined by the maps they moved the pins on back in Berlin. It was defined by the faces I saw, the names I tried to remember, the hands I held. I lost that war 1,000 times over, in 1,000 different shell holes and frozen fields. I didn't come home with victories. I came home with silence and the echoes. And sometimes, when it's very quiet, I can still hear them. I can still hear the retreat. Not the tanks or the guns, but the sound of a young boy breathing, trusting me to save him, while the world fell apart around us. That's the sound that never ends. You want to know what the retreat sounded like? The screaming of the Stukas, the thunder of the Katyushas, we called them, Stalin's organs, endless, sickening crump of artillery getting closer, the metallic rattle of the tracks on the T-34s. But that's not the sound that lives in my bones. The real sound, the one I still hear in my dreams, was the sound of things being left behind. It was a quieter sound, a private sound. It was the soft thud of a pack being opened and rifled through with frantic, frozen fingers. It was the rustle of paper, a photograph being stared at for one last, desperate second before being tucked into an inner pocket, closer to the heart. It was the clink of a canteen against a mess tin, the only music we had as we stumbled west, always west, with the winter wind howling like a chorus of the dead at our backs. And it was, most hauntingly, the sound of things hitting the snow. Not the big things, not the artillery shells or the bodies. The small things. A book falling open, its pages immediately soaking up the grimy slush. A spare pair of boots too heavy to carry another step. A harmonica. That was the true symphony of the retreat. The sound of men becoming lighter, shedding everything but the animal need to live. It was the sound of our old selves being discarded, piece by piece, along that endless white road. And what were those pieces? They weren't just things. Not to us. When you're a boy, you think a soldier carries a rifle and ammunition, and you're not wrong. But you don't understand what else he carries. You don't understand the private treasures, the little anchors that kept us from drifting completely away from who we were. Before the retreat, before the chaos, these items were our secret life. My father, he was a stern man, a cabinet maker with hands like gnarled oak. The day I got my orders, he didn't say much. Words weren't his way. But he pressed his favorite pocket knife into my hand. It was a beautiful thing, a Hirschfenger, with a stag carved into the bone handle. He'd had it since he was my age. "Keep it sharp," was all he said. That knife was worth more to me than my paybook. I used it to open tins, to whittle a splint for a buddy's finger, to carve my initials into a barn wall somewhere in Ukraine, a stupid, childish act that felt like screaming, I was here, I existed. I'd sit in my foxhole, the damp seeping through my greatcoat, and I'd take out that knife and oil the blade with a tiny rag I kept for just that purpose. It was a ritual. As long as I could keep that knife sharp and clean, I felt like I still had some control, some tiny piece of order in a world that had gone completely mad. And then there was the scarf. My little sister, Lot, she knitted it for me. It was a terrible job, full of dropped stitches, and it was much too long, but it was the warmest thing I owned. It smelled faintly of home, of the soap Mother used, and when I wrapped it around my face against the biting Russian cold, It was like a kiss from a world that still made sense. That scarf and that knife, they were practical, you see. They had a job to do, but their real work was invisible. Their real work was to remind me that I was someone's son, someone's brother. I wasn't just Lancer number so-and-so, a cog in a machine that was breaking down. Then there were the things that had no practical use at all. Their value was purely in the memory they held, and that made them heavier than any machine gun cartridge belt. I carried a photograph of my girlfriend, Anna. It was faded from being touched, the corners soft as cloth from being taken out, and stared at 1,000 times. I'd look at it by the flickering light of a candle stuck in a bottle, tracing the smile on her face with my grimy fingertip, trying to remember the smell of her hair, the sound of her laugh. It was a dangerous thing to do, because it made the ache in your chest so much worse, this physical pain of homesickness. But you had to do it. You had to remind yourself of what you were fighting to get back to. Otherwise, you just lie down in the snow and let the cold take you. Some of the men had letters, read so many times they were falling apart at the folds. We taped them back together with medical plaster. I knew one fellow, Klaus, who carried a drawing his 5-year-old son had made of a house with a ridiculously tall chimney and a son with a smiling face in the corner. He kept it in a waterproof map case. He'd de-show it to you, his voice getting soft, and he'd say, "That's my boy's son. He told me to bring it home." Can you imagine the weight of that? You're carrying a full pack, a rifle, your Stahlhelm feeling like a ton of iron on your head, but the heaviest thing on you is a piece of paper with a child's crayon drawing. Because it carried the weight of a whole life, a life you were terrified you'd never see again. We had our dark humor, of course. You had to. You'd see a man looking at his picture and you'd say, "Still waiting for you, is she? Probably dancing with a factory foreman by now." And he'd laugh, a short, bitter laugh, and say, "Better a foreman than a Russian." It was how we showed we cared, by making light of the very things that meant the most. We were all in the same boat, a boat that was sinking fast, and our shared misery was a kind of friendship. Your kameraden, the men in your squad, they were your family. You shared everything, the last bit of black bread, the last cigarette, the last shred of hope. You learned to read the fear in each other's eyes. You knew when a man was at his breaking point, and you'd try to shoulder a little of his burden, maybe carry his mortar plate for an hour, just to keep him going. That closeness, forged in fear and filth, was stronger than any bond I've had since. We weren't fighting for the fatherland anymore, not out there. That grand idea had frozen to death somewhere outside Stalingrad. We were fighting for the man next to us. We were fighting to make sure he got home to see his son's smiling son. And then came the retreat, and all those precious things, the anchors that held us, became weights that could drown us. The order would come down the line, a whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. All Zurich, Safort, everything back immediately. And the race would begin. The Russians were fluid, they moved through the forests like ghosts, and if you were slow, you were encircled, and that was the end. That's when the brutal calculus started. Your pack, which felt normal on a march, suddenly felt like it was filled with lead. Every step was a struggle. The cold wasn't just cold anymore. It was a solid wall you had to push your body through. And you'd start making choices. It's a feeling you can't describe, that moment of agony. You'd open your pack and it was like looking at your own soul laid bare. What part of yourself are you going to leave behind? I remember one day, it must have been near the Dnieper. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. We'd been marching for 2 days with only a few hours of fitful sleep in a bombed-out shed. My feet were blocks of ice in my boots. I had a book, a volume of Goethe's poems my mother had given me. I loved that book. I'd read it by candlelight, the words a temporary escape to a world of beauty and order. But it was heavy. The leather binding, the thick pages. I remember my fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbling with the straps of my pack. I took the book out. I held it in my hands and I looked at it. It was more than paper and ink. It was my education, my civility, a reminder that I was a thinking man, not just an animal running for its life. And I had to let it go. I had to drop it in the snow by the side of the road. I told myself I needed the weight for an extra bandage, for another cartridge, for a handful of frozen potatoes. But the truth was, I just needed to be lighter. I needed to be able to run. The sound it made, that soft, final thud as it landed in the white drift, it was like a door closing. I saw a buddy of mine, Hans, do the same thing with an extra blanket. It was a good blanket, thick wool. He just looked at it, then looked at me, and his eyes, there was no anger in them, just a bottomless, weary sadness. A silent understanding passed between us. We didn't need to speak. We were both sacrificing a piece of our comfort, a piece of our humanity, on the altar of survival. You'd see the trail of our retreat littered with these personal tragedies, a harmonica, a writing set, a pair of felt Valenki some lucky soul had scavenged. It was a road of broken dreams, paved with the things that once made us men. Some things, though, you couldn't part with, no matter what. They became part of you, like an extra limb. For me, it was my father's knife and Lart's scarf. The knife I tucked into my boot. The scarf was always around my neck. They made it home. They're sitting in a drawer in my house right now, not 10 feet from where I'm sitting. The knife is still sharp. The scarf, well, it's fragile now. The wool is thin. But if I take it out, and I don't do it often, I can close my eyes and I'm back there. Not in the big moments, not in the battles you read about in the history books. I'm in a frozen ditch, huddled with my kameraden, the smell of damp wool and cold iron filling my nose. I can taste the metallic fear in the back of my throat. I can hear the wind, that damned eternal wind, and beneath it the faint, crunching sound of footsteps in the snow, never knowing if it was one of ours or one of theirs. These objects, they're not souvenirs. They're not trophies. They're relics. They're the proof. Proof that amidst all that horror, all that chaos, there was a young man who loved his family, who missed his girl, who just wanted to go home. They're the proof that I survived. And sometimes, when the house is quiet, I take out that old knife, and I hold it in my hand, and I can almost feel my father's strength in its handle. And for a moment, I'm not an old man remembering a war. I'm just a boy trying to be brave, trying to keep one small thing sharp and clean in a world that had lost its mind. That's what we carried home. It wasn't much, but it was everything.